On August 10, 1628, Sweden's most powerful warship, the Vasa, set sail on its very first voyage in front of a cheering crowd of thousands lining the Stockholm harbor, and sank less than 20 minutes later, barely a quarter-mile from the dock, without ever firing a single shot in anger or reaching open sea. This isn't a story about a ship lost to storms or enemy attack. The Vasa sank on a calm day, in full view of the crowd that had gathered to celebrate it, and the reason why has been studied by naval engineers and historians ever since as one of the clearest case studies in how catastrophic failure actually happens. In the 1620s, Sweden was locked in a long war with Poland-Lithuania and needed to project naval power across the Baltic Sea. King Gustavus Adolphus personally commissioned a new warship, and he wanted it to be the most powerful vessel his navy had ever built, heavily armed, richly decorated, and unmistakably a symbol of Swedish strength. Construction began in 1626 at a shipyard in Stockholm under a master shipwright named Henrik Habertsson. Partway through construction, the king changed the specifications, ordering a second gun deck added to increase the number of cannons the ship could carry, a major structural change to a design that was already underway. Habertsson fell ill and died before construction finished, leaving less experienced builders to complete a ship whose plans had already been altered mid-build, with no surviving master shipwright to flag that the growing top-heavy design might be unsafe. The finished Vasa carried 64 bronze cannons across 2 gun decks, along with elaborate carved wooden sculptures covering the hull, intended to intimidate enemies and honor the king. It was, by the standards of the day, an extraordinarily expensive and impressive ship. Before the Vasa ever left port, there were warning signs. Shipbuilders of the era tested a new vessel's stability with a simple method. 30 sailors would run back and forth across the deck together, and the ship's rocking would reveal how top-heavy it was. When this test was performed on the Vasa, the ship rocked so alarmingly that the naval official overseeing the test stopped it after only a few passes, worried the ship might capsize right there at the dock. The results were reported up the chain of command. But King Gustavus Adolphus was away leading his army in the war against Poland. The ship's launch had already been publicly scheduled, and no one in the naval hierarchy was willing to be the person who delayed the king's flagship, or admitted that a ship built to his personal specifications might be dangerously flawed. The launch date stayed fixed. On the morning of August 10, 1628, the Vasa was towed out into Stockholm harbor. Sails were raised, cannons were loaded and fired in salute as thousands of spectators watched from the shore, celebrating the newest, most powerful ship in the Swedish Navy setting off on its first voyage. The Vasa sailed less than 4 gun decks worth of distance, about 300 yards, when a moderate gust of wind caught its sails. The ship heeled sharply to one side. It slowly righted itself, and for a moment it seemed the danger had passed. Then a second, similar gust hit. This time the Vasa leaned even further, and water began pouring in through the open lower gun ports, left open so the crew could fire a proper salute as the ship departed. The ship kept tilting. There was no time to close the ports or fire back a corrective response. Within minutes, the Vasa capsized entirely and began sinking, still in full view of the horrified crowd that had gathered to watch it depart in triumph. Of the roughly 150 people aboard for the short maiden voyage, around 30 drowned, trapped below decks or dragged down by the sinking hull. The Vasa settled onto the floor of Stockholm harbor in about 105 feet of water, less than a mile from where it had been launched, sunk not by an enemy, not by a storm, but by its own design, on a calm summer afternoon, in front of everyone who had come to celebrate it. Salvage attempts began almost immediately. Divers managed to recover most of the valuable bronze cannons within a few years using primitive diving bells, but the hull itself, along with dozens of bodies still trapped inside, remained on the harbor floor. Within a few decades, the exact location was forgotten, and the wreck slipped out of common memory for over 300 years. The cold, low-oxygen, low-salinity waters of the Baltic Sea turned out to be an almost perfect preservation environment, conditions that starve out the shipworms that normally destroy wooden wrecks elsewhere in the world's oceans. In 1956, an amateur maritime archaeologist named Anders Fransson, who had spent years searching historical records and dragging the harbor floor with a core sampler, finally located the wreck largely intact. The full salvage operation took place in 1961, and the Vasa was raised from the seabed remarkably whole. Over 95% of the original ship survived, including most of its elaborate carved decoration. It remains, to this day, the best-preserved 17th-century ship ever recovered anywhere in the world. Today, the Vasa sits fully restored inside the Vasa Museum in Stockholm, viewed by more than 1 million visitors every year, the single most popular museum in Scandinavia. Engineers and naval historians still study exactly why it failed. A hull too narrow and top-heavy for the number of guns and decorative stonework it carried, a design altered mid-construction with no one senior enough left alive to object, and a launch date nobody dared to delay. The Vasa never engaged an enemy ship. It never fired a shot except in celebration of its own launch. It remains one of history's clearest examples of a catastrophic engineering failure that everyone involved could see coming, and that no one was willing to be the one to stop.